The Appalachian Valley screamed before Elias Mercer ever saw Black Vein Mountain. The sound cut through dusk like something being dragged beneath the earth. It ended in a silence that felt alive and watching. Elias crossed the rusted bridge alone with his recording gear strapped tightly. Fog rose from the river like breath from a sleeping giant. The mountains ahead looked darker than anything he had studied before. A passing truck driver slowed only long enough to warn him. He said the mine Elias was searching for should have stayed buried in history. Then he refused to say another word and drove away. Elias was left beside an abandoned gas station sinking into weeds. The place smelled of oil, rust, and something faintly metallic like old blood. A woman inside watched him as though she had been expecting him. She told him no one visits Black Vein Mountain and comes back unchanged. Her hands trembled while she pointed at his old mining map. Every missing person in her wall photos had gone toward that mountain. Elias rented a small upstairs room, despite her warnings and silence. The staircase creaked like bones under unseen weight. Symbols carved into the railing seemed freshly etched into old wood. Inside the room, the air smelled of damp paper and burned wax. A Bible lay open on the bed as if placed for him specifically. Most pages were missing except warnings about something beneath the earth. That night, church bells echoed through the valley from no visible church. Elias leaned toward the window and saw lantern lights moving in the fog. The figures carrying them were too tall to be human. One lantern stopped directly beneath his window and tilted upward. A face appeared for a second, stretched and hollow like melted wax. Then everything vanished, as if it had never existed. Morning brought rain that felt unusually cold against Elias's skin. The woman at the counter gave him a tarnished silver coin. She said it was older than the town itself and meant to protect him. The road toward the mountain was lined with dead birds without eyes. Their bodies were untouched, except for empty sockets filled with rainwater. Elias felt watched, even when nothing moved around him. He reached the abandoned mining town by midday beneath heavy clouds. Houses leaned into each other like dying bodies. The wind carried faint whispers through broken windows and collapsed roofs. At the center stood a ruined church, still resisting total collapse. Inside, pews were overturned and claw marks covered the altar wall. Silver crosses lay scattered like discarded warnings. Beneath the altar, Elias found a locked chest buried under debris. Inside were journals written by miners from the 1800s. The ink became darker and more unstable as the entries continued. One miner described a tunnel that appeared where no mapping had recorded. Symbols carved into stone pulsed whenever light touched them. The deeper they dug, the more the mine felt aware of them. Voices began speaking inside the tunnels, even when men stood alone. Some heard family members calling from impossible distances underground. Others heard something older imitating human speech poorly. Sleep disappeared from the miners after only a few weeks. They wandered the town at night, bleeding from their noses. Some returned from the mine with no memory of entering it. A miner named Caleb tore out his eyes, screaming about being seen. He said something beneath the mountain had looked back at him fully. He died before sunrise, holding silver dust in his hands. The final journal pages described bells ringing inside the deepest tunnels. No church existed below ground, yet the sound never stopped. The writer claimed the mountain itself was breathing. A loud crash pulled Elias back into the present moment. Something moved outside the church walls, slowly circling the structure. The air inside grew colder with every passing second. Whispers rose from beneath the wooden floor, like voices trapped below. Elias stepped back as the boards began to tremble. Then suddenly everything went silent at once. Outside, a tall figure stood between gravestones without moving. Its lantern glowed silver even through thick fog. When Elias aimed his light, it disappeared instantly. Panic drove him into the empty mining streets of the town. Fog swallowed entire buildings as bells echoed from underground. He ran toward an office still partially standing. Inside the office, everything was covered in dried stains and decay. Newspapers described a night called the Blood Bell Massacre. The event began when miners returned, changed from the mountain. They spoke in voices that did not belong to them. Families locked themselves indoors while bells rang without stop. Shadows moved faster than any human could possibly move. A preacher's report claimed something ancient had awakened below the mountain. It did not live like a creature, but like an idea wearing flesh. It learned through fear and silence. Fresh footprints appeared suddenly behind Elias inside the office. They were too long and ended directly at the doorway. A whisper told him the mine was still open beneath everything. Heavy footsteps moved across the ceiling above him. Wood cracked as something crawled overhead slowly. Silver liquid began dripping through the beams. The ceiling exploded inward with violent force and collapsing debris. Elias ran as something enormous tore through the building behind him. The sound of bells became painfully loud in his ears. Fog thickened as night arrived far too quickly. He heard his father's voice calling him through the empty streets. It sounded both comforting and wrong at the same time. The voice led him to a cabin deep near the forest edge. Inside, candles burned without being touched. An old man sharpened a silver blade without looking up. He introduced himself as Samuel Rook, last of a guarding bloodline. His ancestors helped seal the mine generations ago. He said the seal was never meant to last forever. Samuel showed journals describing miners entering a hidden chamber. Inside stood an altar surrounded by bones far older than the mine. Anyone who touched it began hearing promises. The entity beneath the mountain fed on suffering and memory. It learned to imitate voices to lure people deeper. Silver was the only material that slowed it. The town sealed the mine using molten silver poured into its entrance. For 3 nights, screams came from below the rock. Something tried to climb out and failed. Samuel revealed his father had disappeared trying to reinforce the seal. The mountain had been weakening for years without anyone noticing. Now it was close to breaking. They traveled to the mine entrance under a sky without stars. Trees around them looked twisted like screaming silhouettes. Every sound in the forest felt deliberately placed. The sealed entrance was wrapped in cracked silver bars. Black fluid leaked from fractures in the metal. The ground beneath it vibrated like something breathing. Symbols carved into stone pulsed faintly under Samuel's light. He said they were meant to silence what lived below. Suddenly the metal bent inward. Wind burst from the tunnel carrying the smell of decay. Elias heard his name spoken by many voices at once. The seal began splitting open slowly. Inside, tunnels stretched downward into impossible darkness. Walls were covered in scratches and warning marks. Old tools remained where workers dropped them in terror. Deeper inside, figures stood waiting in collapsed side tunnels. Their bodies were twisted but familiar in shape. Lantern light reflected off something unnatural in their skin. A miner stepped forward, speaking in Gideon Voss's voice. He warned them the mountain had finally awakened fully. Behind him, more miners began emerging silently. Samuel raised his silver blade as the air grew colder. The miners moved like puppets controlled by something unseen. Liquid silver dripped from their mouths and eyes. A roar echoed from deep below, shaking the entire tunnel system. The miners immediately knelt as if responding to a command. Then they retreated into darkness. The path led into a massive underground cavern. Symbols covered every surface like a language carved into stone. At the center stood a silver altar. Chains stretched across a bottomless pit in the cavern floor. Several were already broken and hanging loose. Wind rose from below, carrying thousands of whispers. Blood stained the altar, as if recent rituals had occurred there. Samuel said people never stopped coming to this place. Even after the sealing, something kept calling. Another chain snapped, echoing like thunder underground. Black mist rose from the pit, slowly forming shapes. Something enormous was waking beneath everything. Samuel ordered Elias to spread silver dust across the altar. The moment it touched stone, screaming filled the cavern. The mountain began reacting violently. Something rose from the pit, covered in shifting faces. Its body contained thousands of trapped human expressions. It spoke through overlapping voices at once. Samuel drove his blade into the altar as silver light erupted. The entity screamed and pulled backward into darkness. The cavern began collapsing around them. Elias ran through falling stone and breaking tunnels. Samuel stayed behind, holding back the collapsing force. Then everything disappeared beneath rock and silence. Elias reached the surface as the mountain collapsed behind him. The valley fell completely silent for the first time. He thought it was over, but beneath the earth, church bells began ringing again.